Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In the spirit of First Baptist and Steve Scoggins, we're going to get started a couple minutes early tonight. Welcome. We are going to be talking about apologetics, and I'm excited to have everybody here. Dave Marshall, just a couple months ago, he approached me and talked to me and said, "Hey, Dan, I know you really like apologetics, and you've got a little series that you've done with various Sunday school groups, and especially when I was talking to or teaching the high schoolers, would you be interested in doing that?" And I said, "Hey, that sounds like a great idea. I do have this little series that is usually about 6 to 8 sessions. We can do it in 6 or 7. And he said, "That sounds great. Let's do it in 2 Wednesday nights." So that is what we're going to be doing. Needless to say, they're usually 30-minute sessions, so we have a total of 2 hours, so we can at least get 4 things in here. Needless to say, we've got a lot to cover, so I am going to go fairly rapidly, and I've tried to condense this as much as possible and trim whatever fat is out there, but if I sound like I'm talking very fast this evening, it's because I'd like to get through all the information. Speaking of which, I would love to have questions or comments, but if it is possible for you to save those till the end, to make sure we do have some time, if that's the case, and I might cover some things that you have questions in the meantime. So if I need to be interrupted, go ahead, but if possible, we could wait till the end to do that. That would be great. Let me tell you just briefly about very briefly, my spiritual journey. I grew up in a Christian family, Christian parents. Every time the doors were open to the church, I went to church. And I really felt like I had a pretty good grounding in the Bible. I knew about Adam and Moses and Jesus and Paul and that kind of thing. But when I got into high school and college, and especially into like medical school and some of my medical training, I realized that I had some knowledge of why I believed what I believed, but not a great knowledge. So I really started to get into apologetics. I wanted to know why the things that I had been taught as a child and young adult and teenager were true. And what I found out through that spiritual journey or looking into apologetics is something that's interesting. Many people that I have dealt with over the years, especially in my field of science, I'm a physician, and so a lot of people would say, "Oh," when I would bring up Christianity or religion, they're like, "Oh, you're into that faith or blind faith where there's no reason." And science, of course, is about evidence and reason and its logic, but you're not into that. What I found was when you look at the evidence for Christianity, it's exactly the opposite. That the weight of the evidence is in favor of Christianity. And if you talk to anybody, even somebody who says, "I don't believe in that religion stuff, I believe in facts and science and so forth," they too still have philosophical presuppositions. And I'm going to hopefully show tonight and next Wednesday that the weight of the evidence, simply using some logic and the brains that God has given us, shows that the weight of the evidence is that Christianity is true, that it does correspond to reality. So with that, what is apologetics? Apologetics simply means a defense of something you believe or something that you do. We typically will use the word apology to say, "I'm sorry, I don't have a good excuse for whatever I did or believed." But technically, apologetics means to present the evidence or a defense of what you believe or what you have done. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to read this, and I want somebody to tell me if they recognize who this is. "So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe.'" Who is that?
Thomas.
And what's the adjective we use for Thomas? Doubting Thomas. Now, I'm going to tell you, I think he gets a bad rap. I actually think that he's got it right. That he's not going to just believe anybody who comes and says, "I'm Jesus," or "I'm the Lord," or "I'm this or that." He wants at least some evidence. And the greater the claim, the greater the evidence that he needs to see this. Now, to his credit, what happened after this verse? Do you know or remember? Jesus said, "I'm here," and Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." So he did believe it when he saw the evidence. And I really can relate to Thomas. As I mentioned before, I want to know why I believe what I believe. Here's something out of Acts. This is Paul. He's before basically the judge. The judge is Festus. He's got Paul's life in his hands, and Paul basically tries to convert him right there in court to become a Christian. And here's what the Acts 26 says. At this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. "You are out of your mind, Paul," he shouted. "Your great learning is driving you insane." "I am not insane, most excellent Festus," Paul replied. "What I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner." Another point I'd like to make about apologetics is, and Christianity in particular, is that there's not some secret society. It's not a cult where you need to get initiated into some secret information to know this or that. This is open to everybody. God has made it open to everybody. And in fact, I believe God, when Jesus said, "Ask, seek, and knock, and the door will be open to you," He's looking for people who are trying to investigate the truth, what is truly out there. One other one in John chapter 1. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." "Nazareth? Can anything good come from there?" Nathanael said. "Come and see," said Philip. So God is inviting us to come investigate the evidence for Christianity. I already mentioned that I think the primary reason for this is that it will help your faith. It certainly helped my faith. Once I knew that the evidence was in favor of Christianity, that the Bible was real, there was a God, Jesus was who He said He was, the resurrection was true, and many other things, that really helped my faith. But another reason that we need to know why we believe what we believe is mentioned in 1 Peter 3:15. "Always be prepared to give an answer to everybody who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." So we do need to keep that in mind, that we're not trying to win an argument. We're trying to help people find salvation and find eternal life. So we must keep that in mind when we look at these things. All right. With that, let me go to the first official topic that we're going to be talking about. Is there a God? Does a God exist? And you'll notice that I put God with a small g, not a capital G. I'm going to ask you for at least just a little bit, if you can pretend with me, if you already are a Christian, that pretend that you're out in Africa or in Asia and you've never heard about Jesus. You don't have a Bible. All you know is what you see and what you live every day. So let's pretend at least for a little bit that that's the case. What evidence is there either for or against atheism or theism? And so the question is there a God? Does a God exist? Now, depending on how you answer those questions, you will be one of essentially 4 categories. Now, depending on if you're a lumper or a splitter, you can do more or less, but I've got 4 up here. If you say that there is no God, then you would be considered an atheist. If you say, "I don't know if there's a God or not," then you would be an agnostic. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge, so if you put an A in front of anything, it means not that. A pantheist is a God, it means that you believe a God is everything or is in everything. That's what Hinduism, Buddhism, some Eastern religions would be more in line with. We won't talk a lot about that. And then the last one would be atheist, those who believe that there is a God. Now, interestingly, in my readings and in my interactions with various people, many of whom my classmates and so forth were atheists, and I would have some conversations with them, and one of the things that I would point out to them with atheism is if you are a true atheist, then you must have infinite knowledge. What do I mean by that? Here's the example that I've given to different people on this. I gave the example, if I said that there has never in the history of the world been a married couple with the names, and I asked the names, and this was a junior high class, they came up with Mildred and Buford. Don't ask me why. There has never been a married couple in the history of the world with the names Mildred and Buford. What would I have to know in order to make that statement? I'd have to know every single married couple in the history of the world before I could make that statement. In the same way, with atheism, you would have to have traveled throughout the universe and known everything and said, I have not discovered or seen a God. So, usually when you point that out to most people who claim to be atheists, they'll quickly retreat into the agnostic category and say, well, I don't think there's one, but maybe I'm not for sure. Although I have certainly met a few people, and I'll talk about a few of these, who say, nope, I'm still an atheist. I am quite confident there is no God. All right. If atheism is true, then there are some logical positions that you have to come to or that you have to take. Just simply by logic, if there is no God, there are several things, two of which I'm going to kind of hone in on here. The first is there is no objective right and wrong. And you'll notice I put the word objective there. I originally, when I first did this series 25 years ago, I just said there is no right and wrong. And somebody pointed out to me that people can make up right and wrong all they want. So I put on here there's no objective right and wrong. Some of you may have heard about the, C.S. Lewis talks a lot about this, the moral law. Basically, the moral law just means that there is a right and a wrong, and that we have within us a conscience where we know what is right and wrong. Well, if there is a moral law, by logical deduction, there must be a moral lawgiver. Now, of course, Christians would say that's the God of the Bible. But if there is no God, then there is no objective right and wrong. Now, talking to a few atheists over the years, many of them will say, well, no, that's not true. I believe that there's a right and a wrong. And the question that you might want to ask them is, well, how do you decide then what's right and wrong if there is no God? Many times you'll get some of these answers. Might makes right. If you live in China, let's say, for instance, if the government says you're going to do this or not do this, they're in power and you've got to do that. If, let's say, you live in a democracy, or a constitutional republic, technically, it might be majority rules. If enough people vote for something, then that makes it right. So if enough people vote for abortion, or same-sex marriage, or whatever it is that we may not agree with, supposedly that makes it right if enough people say that that's the case. Then the last one is what you'll mostly get from people if you ask them, how do you decide what's right and wrong? And it's based on feelings. I had a conversation with a neighbor back in 2012. For those that were living in the state of North Carolina, if you remember back in 2012, we had the marriage amendment on the ballot at the time, voting for or against same-sex marriage. And I got in a conversation with him about that, and I stated my position that I didn't think it was a great idea, and he thought it was. And I said, well, why do you think that's a good idea? What makes you think that? And he basically said, well, I just feel that that's right. We shouldn't exclude anybody, and so forth. So I then posited to him the questions. I said, well, if things are just based on feelings, what do you think about a father marrying his daughter, or cousins marrying, or whatever? I thought of the most crazy thing I could think of. And he thought about it for a minute and said, no, that's not right. And I said, well, why not? He said, well, I just don't feel like that situation is right. And I thought, well, based on feelings, you can kind of come to whatever you want to. I read about a debate between Bertrand Russell, who's an atheist, and a theist a long time ago. And the person that was debating him asked him that question, how do you decide what's right and wrong? And he said, well, based on feelings. And the writer of the book said the best response would have been, in some cultures, people love their neighbors. In other cultures, they eat their neighbors, both based on feelings. Do you have a preference where you live? So, if atheism is true, then there is no objective right and wrong. I'm going to talk about Friedrich Nietzsche. Anybody heard of this guy? Come on, Eric, get that hand up. I know you've heard of this guy. He was a German philosopher in the 1800s, and he, from my understanding, essentially coined the term God is dead. He wrote a couple of books and so forth, and basically said, in our modern society, we don't need God anymore. There's no need for Him. There's no thing like that. And here's what he said specifically about Christianity. I might note that if you talk to some atheists or read in the literature, there is no objective right and wrong, but if you really get down to it, they think that Christians are wrong. And they don't like us because they say you're duping other people and giving them these fairy tales, and they get angry. I've always wondered, if there's no God and it doesn't matter, why would you care about that anyway? But there it is. Here's what Friedrich Nietzsche said: I call Christianity the one great curse, the one enormous and innermost perversion, the one great instinct of revenge, for which no means are too venomous, too underhand, too underground, and too petty. So if you're an atheist, you really don't like people who are saying that there is a God. And again, he at least philosophically, was a true atheist. He admitted that, yep, there was no right and wrong. Well, you notice that I mentioned that he was a German philosopher in the 1800s. Well, what happened in Germany about 100 years after that? A disciple of Nietzsche by the name of Adolf Hitler came to power. And he was, now granted, he used the church and some religious things in the Lutheran church to get people to do what he wanted, but he was truly an atheist. Here's what he said: I freed Germany from the stupid and degrading fallacies of conscience and morality. We will train young people before whom the world will tremble. I want young people capable of violence, imperious, relentless, and cruel. So that's what you get if there is no God. And I might add that if there is no God, like I said, there's no right and wrong. Now, I've talked to many people who claim to be atheists, and they say, well, I'm not a bad person. I'm not like Adolf Hitler. I haven't killed anybody. I haven't raped anybody. I don't steal things. I give to the homeless and needy. And I say, that's right. But the difference here is that if there is no God, that system of living is exactly equal to the person who is a murderer, rapist, thief, whatever you want to talk about it. They're morally equivalent because there is no morality if there is no God. So we talked about no objective right and wrong, and the second thing that naturally or logically flows if there is no God is that everything is meaningless. Your life means nothing. You have no significance. You have no purpose. Live your 72.4 average years, and that's all there is to it. Live it up, have a good time, but everything is meaningless. Now, I personally think that if you look at our society, and particularly with teenagers and young adults, but it's throughout the society, but particularly that age group, if indeed there is no God, we came from some monkeys millions of years ago, there's no right, there's no wrong, everything is meaningless. I think this is why we're having an epidemic, especially among young people, on depression, anxiety, suicide, whatever that is. If there is no meaning, it can really mess with your brain. One of my favorite quotes about this is from Aldous Huxley. Anybody recognize that name? He wrote Brave New World and a few other things. He was from England. I'm sorry, if you can't read this, I'll give you my card at the end. But let me, in the bill, all right, I got you back there, okay. Let me read this real quickly. Here's what he had to say about this. I had motives for not wanting the world to have a meaning, and consequently assumed that it had none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. The philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with the problem in pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do. For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. He's basically saying, I didn't want there to be a God, because if there's a God, then I have to live my life a certain way. I will be accountable one day. But if I just say or convince myself that there is no God, I can basically do whatever I want to do. Now, he's being logically consistent with that. I think he's dead wrong, but at least he's being logically consistent. And I will say, I understand this completely. As human beings, we understand this. Who do you want to be in charge of your life in a naturalistic sense? I want to be in charge of my life. I want things to happen the way I want them to happen. I want to be in control. But God says, nope, I'm out here. I'm in control. And that's a hard thing to give in to for many people, because it does mean you can't do, whatever you want. You can't live whatever life you want. You're going to be held to account one day. All right, so there is no objective right and wrong if atheism is true and everything is meaningless. Now, that doesn't mean just because that's the case that proves that there's a God. But my question to you is, does this correspond to reality? Does this correspond to your lived reality in your life? If somebody comes and steals something from you, if they do something evil to you, do you feel like, oh, well, that's okay. There's no such thing as right and wrong? I know for myself, I have been through a difficult time in the past year or so where I know people lied about me. Some evil things were perpetrated against me. And I have thought about this. If I didn't believe in God, that there was one day going to be ultimate justice, then I probably would lash out and revenge or do something to just get out of here. But the fact is that this does not correspond to reality, that there is no right and wrong and life is meaningless. Something inside of us says there is a right and wrong, and something said, my life is more than just these few years I have on this earth. All right. One last one. I'm not going to read the whole thing in the interest of time, but you might recognize this name, Voltaire. He was a French philosopher, brilliant guy, and I'm not going to read the whole thing in the interest of time, but I'm going to kind of go down here about midway. He's basically saying that man goes to war, he dies, birds come and eat him, and then subsequently more men shoot the birds, and the whole cycle of life goes around. And as with quaking voice, mortal and pitiful ye cry, all's well. The universe belies you, and your heart refutes 100 times your mind's conceit. What is the verdict of the vastest mind? Silence. The book of fate is closed on us. Man is a stranger to his own research. He knows not whence he comes, nor whither he goes. Tormented atoms in a bed of mud, devoured by death, a mockery of fate. I hear this guy's a lot of fun at parties and bar mitzvahs, by the way. So anyway, his point is that we are just a bunch of atoms that are here for so many years, and we go back to dust, and there's nothing else, if indeed there is no God. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about, I've given you some evidence for the weaknesses, and again, I'm just scratching the surface on this, for atheism. Let's talk a little bit about some positive evidence that there is a God out there. We talk about many times here in church and in apologetics and philosophy various things that point to potentially a God. There's a category called general revelation, which basically means anybody who's a human being and lived on the earth, these things are revealed to you, whether you're in the U.S. or whether you're in Africa or wherever. Then there's something called specific revelation. That is, by the name, more specific. Any guesses? Let's talk about general revelation. There are two main categories of general revelation, and depending on what words you use, they both start with a C. Anybody know any of the two categories of general revelation that there potentially is a God that's revealed to any person that has a human experience? Creation and conscience. That is exactly right. So the first one is creation. And let me real quickly go here. I'm sorry, I'm going around here. In Romans chapter 1 and elsewhere in the Bible, but specifically in Romans chapter 1, Paul talks about, since the creation of the world, paraphrasing, men are without excuse if they say there is no God, simply by creation. I'm going to touch on this real quickly here. I was giving a talk about Genesis chapter 1 and 2 a few months ago, and up until about 100 years ago, scientists, at least atheistic or non-theistic scientists, felt that the universe was eternal. It was had always been there, and it was static, that you look up and the sun is there, it's the same distance. You look at the North Star, you look at this Andromeda galaxy, and it's fixed. It's been steady forever, basically. Well, interestingly, about 100 years ago, a guy named Edwin Hubble, does that ring a bell? The Hubble Space Telescope? He made some startling discoveries. And what he discovered was that the universe was expanding. He also, well, not he, but later on some other people found out that or discovered that the universe was not only expanding, but it was expanding faster and faster. Galaxies are flying apart faster and faster and faster. Well, you can imagine if up until this time most scientists had thought that the universe was static, and now we know that it is expanding. Imagine if the time goes forward, you see things expanding. Well, what if you turn this into reverse? What if you hit the rewind button? Things were expanding this way. What happens if you hit the rewind button? Everything comes back to a single point at some point in the past. What does that kind of sound like, or what is it consistent with? It's consistent with what we read in the Bible, that God created the universe ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing. And so astronomers call this a singularity event, that the universe happened at one point. And it was coined the Big Bang by Fred Hoyle back in 1948. Now, a lot of people recoil at the Big Bang for various reasons, but that's a very good description of what happened. As I said here, God said it, and bang, it happened. But interestingly enough, cosmology, and the more we learn about things, the more it appears that this didn't just happen, this universe, by chance. That there was something behind it and that it had an actual beginning. Well, if you know anything about causality, there's something called a causal chain of events. You can have 10, you can have 20, you can have two things that cause something to happen. A causes B, B causes C, C causes D, etc. But nothing can cause the first cause. The first cause has to be uncaused, which again sounds a lot like an eternal God. So the astronomers at this time had a big problem on their hands, because that evidence was that there was a beginning, that something or somebody started the universe. They've come up with all kinds of other theories, which I won't go into today, but I briefly wanted to show you just a couple other things. Anybody familiar with the James Webb telescope? It has been out for about a year and a half. It was launched actually 2 years ago, and it started taking pictures about a year and a half ago. Best telescope we've ever had. I actually had an email conversation going on with my uncle, he's got a PhD in math, very smart guy, but he's an atheist. And we've had conversations over the years, and I was talking to him about this a little while ago, and I said, the more we understand about cosmology and science and so forth, the more untenable I believe it is to think that there is no God, that this just happened by chance. And real briefly, just to show you this, as you can see in Psalm chapter 19, by the way, it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of His hands." There are some incredible pictures that this telescope has taken. It's advancing on my screen. There we go. Just got a time to catch up. Now, just because these are amazing and beautiful, that doesn't prove there's a God. But again, I think there's great evidence that there is a God with these pictures. I just find these quite fascinating. Anyway, that is, every point of light you see there is a star. All right, let's go back to atheism. So we talked a little bit about the evidence for a God. General revelation is creation, and what's the second one? The conscience. Now, the conscience not only argues for theism or a God, it argues against atheism. You remember, if there is no God, there's no such thing as right and wrong. Well, let's talk a little bit about C.S. Lewis. One of the best books, and it's a golden oldie that I have ever read on apologetics. Very simple, not a big long one, and it's just even the first 4 or 5 small chapters is called Mere Christianity. If you haven't read it, you should read this. But in those first few chapters of Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis talks about a conscience that we each have in us. And he wrote the book shortly after World War II, so keep that in mind as I read this. What was the sense in saying that the enemy were in the wrong unless right is a real thing, which the Nazis at bottom knew as well as we did and ought to have practiced? If they had had no notion of what we mean by right, then though we still may have had to fight them, we could no more have blamed them for that than for the color of their hair. His point is that we all have a conscience. When they went to Nuremberg at the trials and they tried the Nazis, The Nazis could not just give a defense of, well, there's no God, there's no such thing as right and wrong, I have no conscience. They didn't accept that because we know that each individual human being has this thing in them called a conscience, in my opinion, given by God, where we do know that there are some things that are absolutely wrong and some things that are absolutely right. And again, Mere Christianity, if you want to flesh this out a little bit more, is a great read for that. Last quote here from C.S. Lewis. He talks a lot about this idea of a right and wrong and a conscience, and that it's a standard that everybody knows, and yet it's not written down. It's not written down in every room, in every house. It's just something that we all know of internally, and that we all assume everybody else knows as well. Here's what he said. If there was a controlling power outside the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe. No more than the architect of a house could actually be a wall or staircase or fireplace in that house. The only way in which we could expect it to show itself would be inside ourselves as an influence or a command trying to get us to behave in a certain way. And that is just what we do find inside ourselves. The only information packet I am allowed to open is man. And when I do, especially when I open that particular man called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law, that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way. And again, that comes back to your conscience that God gives us, the sense of right and wrong. He talks a lot about a standard. For instance, he talks about if somebody comes and steals something from you, and everybody's watching or sees that, everybody immediately says, that's not right. If somebody cuts in front of you in line at the store or at the restaurant, everybody says, hey, that's not right. And you appeal to this thing that's not written down, but that you expect everybody to know. And that's basically what he's getting at with this conscience. So, we looked at atheism and some of the downsides against it, and then some of the things that are for theism. General revelation, we have creation, and we have a conscience that tells us right and wrong. I also mentioned that there are, again, depending on whether you're a lumper or a splitter, I've got two categories of direct revelation. Who thinks they know one or both of the direct revelations that God has given us? Don't be afraid to say it out loud. Jesus. I'm going to count them all together in the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and Holy Spirit. That's one, but we're going to specifically talk about Jesus. There's another one that you may have in your hand, the Bible. That's exactly right. So now, in our next session, we're doing all right here, we are going to specifically talk about the Bible. Is the Bible reliable? And when I say that, let me briefly just kind of explain what I mean by that. Many people, and I just saw a few days ago, I was kind of looking at some things, a Joe Rogan podcast. He was making the claim that the Bible it's good, it's got some good sayings. Jesus was a good guy, he was a prophet, he was very moral and so forth. But the Bible that we have right now isn't what was originally written by the people, the authors back then. It's been copied and recopied and copied again, and it's been embellished and new stories have been in there. So what we're reading isn't really what they said right there. It's basically a bunch of fairy tales. That is a common thing that you will hear. So that's the question, is the Bible that we have or that you have in your hands reliable? Is it what the actual authors wrote 2,000, 3,000 years ago, whatever it was? Now, whether you believe what they wrote or not is a separate question about faith. But we're going to look at is what you have in your hands, your Bible, is that what was written by the authors? And again, I'll go quickly here. If I told you about a book that was written over a 1,500-year time span by over 40 authors from all walks of life, kings, peasants, philosophers, fishermen, poets, statesmen, herdsmen, tax collectors, doctors, military generals, etc. It was written from a host of different places on 3 different continents. With the greatest readership of all time and a circulation of greater than 6 billion copies, translated into more languages, and I just looked this up on Google, because if it's on the internet, it's true. 1,658 different translations or different languages of the New Testament. And this is more than any other book that has ever been out there, that it has not only survived but thrived through undoubtedly the fiercest persecution and most voluminous criticism that the world has ever known, that made countless predictions that eventually came true, and that was called the greatest history book of antiquity, and it contained the sayings and the history of the most influential person who the world has ever seen. Would it not behoove an intelligent person to read and investigate this book that has drawn more attention than any other if you are searching for the truth? Of course, the answer is yes, and of course, I am talking about the Bible. Now, I think I can fairly say, having talked to my parents and maybe a generation before mine at least, or even before then, that the Bible, at least in maybe our country or our culture in general, and I'm speaking in general terms, used to be accepted as authoritative by most. But I don't think we can say that anymore in our culture. I think many people still believe in the Bible, but it's not nearly what it used to be. Why do people not believe it anymore? Many people say that the Bible is a myth. It's a fictitious account. Why do people say that? Well, here are some of the reasons that people will say that. In the Bible, there are parallel accounts with other stories of ancient literature. For instance, there's some writings from the Babylonians, the Sumerians, and other things about a flood, so those are similar. Now, my argument would be maybe there was a worldwide flood, and that's why each of these different cultures have a flood story. But that's one of the reasons that people say that. Another one is that there are some similarities between events surrounding Jesus and those of the Greek gods of mythology, especially the resurrection story in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So, those are some of the reasons why people say that the Bible's a myth, because it parallels other writings that we know are mythical. But when you compare, I remember in tests that I used to take in high school, they'd always say, compare and contrast these things. So when you compare them, you must also contrast them. We must also look at the differences between the Bible and other ancient stories. First of all, the Bible is pretty sober. Here's the facts, ma'am. There are some stories that are pretty wild and crazy, but it's generally a very sober book. It gives you, here's what happened. It reveals unflattering details. Now, if you were inventing a religion or you wanted people to worship you, would you include all the bad things that you do or say or over the years? No, you'd want to say all the good stuff. But the Bible, it reveals a lot of things. We're in our kind of family devotions right now, we're reading through the book of Genesis. And boy, you read some stuff in there, even if you've read it a lot of times, you're like, this is some wildlife stuff that's going on back in Genesis. Mythic creatures, bizarre creation stories, like people are the appendages of a god, the result of procreation between gods, things spring anew out of the head of Zeus. Those kinds of wild and crazy things are noticeably absent from the Bible. And ultimately, the Bible is rooted in history. When Luke, when Paul, when Jesus, when the disciples talk about they're in Jerusalem, and here's what happened on this date. And we went to the Forum, the Areopagus in Corinth or in Athens. They are talking about real places, real times, real events that we can look back in history and say, these things did happen. If you'll look at other religions, other cults, and I'm certainly not trying to pick on anybody, but I think of some friends I've had who are Mormons. They said that Jesus came to North America after His resurrection, and He dealt with all kinds of these cultures, and they gave names of them. Well, guess what? Have we found any of those cultures in history or archaeology? No. The Bible is rooted in actual history that gives credence to the fact that we can trust it. Well, let's look at how do we determine if the Bible is reliable, that we can trust it. Josh McDowell, a famous apologist, I have one of his books here, More Than a Carpenter, which is another excellent book. He says that he has never had anybody answer that question, Christians included. So what tests do we look at to determine whether the Bible or any book is reliable? He says that there are 3 basic tests that we should look at for any book, including the Bible. One is the bibliographical test, which I'll explain what that means in a moment. Number 2 is the internal evidence test. Does the Bible agree with itself? Are there any blatant contradictions between one author and another? Or are there multiple contradictions? If that's the case, then we probably say that book is not reliable. And the third one is the external evidence test. What does the world around us say about the Bible? Does it agree with it? Does it corroborate it? Or does it disagree with it? And we're going to look at 4 specific things: extra-biblical authors and historians, prophecies, science, and archaeology. We're going to look at the first test first, however, and that is the bibliographical test. As I mentioned, a lot of people say that the New Testament that we have now is actually an embellishment of the original New Testament documents, that stories got tacked onto it as it got copied over the centuries and millennia. It is true that we only have copies of the originals. We don't have the original manuscript that Matthew wrote, or Luke, or John, or so forth, but we have copies of those. So let's look at some important bibliographical criteria. Is this showing up when I click on it? It is not. There we go. That looks a little bit better. There we go. That's what I'm trying to get to. Sorry about that. So here's a list of some very famous ancient manuscripts, books, whatever you want to call them, by different authors and so forth. In the interest of time, again, let me direct your attention to the bottom one. Anybody heard of a guy named Homer? All right. Anybody ever read the Iliad or been assigned to read the Iliad? You may not have read the whole thing. Let me focus in on that one just for a minute to explain kind of what this table means. So Homer wrote the Iliad, and the earliest copy we have of the Iliad dates to 400 BC. That copy is about 500 years after the original was written by Homer. So, who are our mathematicians in here? If the original, or the earliest copy we have is 400 BC, and the original was written 500 years before that, when was Homer around and when did he write the Iliad? 900 BC. As I've always said, Dave, there are 3 kinds of people in this world: those who are good at math and those who aren't. Anyway, we also have 643 copies. And granted, I don't know how they get that number because they're in textbooks around the world, so we have millions of them, but somehow when they say original copies, we have 643 of those, okay? Anybody in your high school or college classes, if you took this and read this, did anybody have a professor that said, oh, by the way, I'm assigning you the Iliad, and it's not actually what Homer wrote, it's a bunch of other junk that got added on, we have no idea what he wrote? Anybody ever heard somebody say that? No. We have 643 copies. We're pretty sure that they all fairly agree with each other, that we know what Homer wrote, okay? So keep that in mind as we look at the New Testament. The New Testament, the earliest compilation of all the books in the New Testament that we have, dates to about 125 AD. That is roughly about 25 years after the last book of the New Testament was written. And we have, count them, this is an old figure too, so I have no idea, it may be more than this. We have over 25,000 copies of the New Testament. And yet people will say, nah, we can't trust what we have in our hands here. It got made up, these embellishing stories. And compare that to all the others on this table. Not even close. Now, let's talk a little bit about textual corruption. The Iliad has roughly 15,600 lines of text. I don't know how they come up with a line, but anyway, that's what it is. 764 of them are in question. In other words, if you take the 643 copies of the Iliad we have, 764 of those 15,000 lines disagree with each other. It may be a word, it may be a phrase, it may be an entire line. That's roughly about 5% of the Iliad. We don't know exactly what Homer wrote. A good idea, but we can't say it exactly. The New Testament has roughly 20,000 lines, only 40 of which are in question or may not agree with each other, which is about 0.5%. And note what the editors of the Revised Standard Version say. None has turned up thus far that requires a revision of Christian doctrine. In other words, it might be an A instead of a the, or a little phrase here and there, but it doesn't change the meaning of what was written. So two very famous gentlemen that this is their life's work, is looking at ancient texts and so forth, had this to say. In contrast with these figures, the textual critic of the New Testament is embarrassed by the wealth of material. And F.F. Bruce says there is no body of ancient literature in the world which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. This is an old one, old picture from 2015, when my wife Tanya and I and our daughter Sarah were on a trip through the church to Israel. We visited many places, but one of the places that we visited that I was excited to visit was Qumran. It's on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, and this is where the what are called the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. You may have heard of that. I'll tell you a little bit about that. Back in 1947, a Bedouin, somebody who just they and their families wandered around with livestock and so forth, came here, and one of the teenagers went in this little cave right there. And it's funny, you'll notice on books about the Old Testament, that's almost always the picture on the cover here. But what happened was he threw a rock down into like a cave in there, and he heard something shatter. It just didn't hit stone, something shattered. So they went and looked down there, and there were a bunch of vases. I think that's the word they use. And what they found in the vases were much of the Old Testament from a group of people called the Essenes that had copied the Old Testament, and they kind of lived by themselves in this corner of the Dead Sea. And they found these Dead Sea, what are called the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not the entire Old Testament, but many books of them, specifically Isaiah. They found the entire book of Isaiah written back in the time of the Essenes, which was before Christ. They think maybe 100 to 200 BC. So let's look at this. The significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls should never be underestimated. They answer one of the most critical questions of life. How do we know that the Bible, and specifically the Old Testament, keep that in mind, that we have today has been passed down to us accurately, and is its message trustworthy? Until these texts became available, the oldest Hebrew Old Testament text in existence dated back to AD 800. Okay, so up until 1947, the earliest copy of the Old Testament was from 800 AD. No original manuscripts of the Bible exist today, so the next best thing is to go back to the oldest copies that would be closest to the originals. The Dead Sea Scrolls allow for that because they are 800 to 1,000 years older than those previous oldest manuscripts that we had. And here's what Mark Creech said about this. What the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts clearly demonstrate is that through about 1,000 years, there was essentially no significant alteration in the text. The scribes who transcribed the text of the Bible were so meticulous, they had such high standards of accuracy, counting every word and every letter of every word, dotting each I and crossing each T, so to speak, that one may be absolutely certain that the Old Testament text available to scholars today is in essence the same as the originals. The Dead Sea Scrolls are an incontrovertible archaeological confirmation that this is the case. So we know, based on the bibliographical test, that what we have today in our Bibles, the Old and the New Testament, it's reliable. It's what the authors actually wrote at the time they did that. The next test that we look at in evaluating any source, but specifically the Bible, is the internal evidence test. In other words, does the Bible agree with itself? Is it telling the truth? Well, there's some evidence that helps confirm that the Bible is consistent. One of those is that not all of them, but many writers appealed as eyewitnesses. Now, my understanding, I want to stay as far away from attorneys and lawyers, no offense, as possible, but my understanding is if you go to a trial, who are the best type of witnesses? The eyewitnesses that says, I was there, I saw this happen. So many of the writers of the Bible claim to be eyewitnesses, specifically some of the disciples that wrote the Gospels, and Paul as well. Even more confirmatory, the writers appealed to common knowledge. Here's what Peter said at Pentecost. Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. He said it's not hidden, it's not some secret knowledge that I have. You know this. It was common knowledge. And here again, we're going back to Acts chapter 26, where Paul says this, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. For the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice. For this has not been done in a corner. Jesus was a public figure, at least the last few years of his ministry. Nothing was hidden. It was common knowledge. The other thing that I briefly alluded to before, the Bible has unflattering, embarrassing details that are not concealed. And again, in the interest of time, I won't read this, but there's a page here in More Than a Carpenter that lists a bunch of things that the Bible reveals that are unflattering. You wouldn't want to know this about the disciples. If you read anything about the disciples, you know they had a lot of ambition and they didn't understand who Jesus was and all kinds of things in there. All right. The key questions, are there any blatant contradictions? People accept this without hesitation. I probably in our day and age shouldn't put somebody's name down, but one of my best friends in medical school, his name was Jeff Dreyer. He was Jewish and he was an atheist. And we had many conversations because he thought I was an interesting person, believing in what he thought were myths, and he just kind of looked at me as if I was some archaeological find that he had, that somebody still believes that stuff. So anyway, we had lots of conversations about this, and one of the first things he said to me was, well, the Bible's full of contradictions. And I was doing some apologetic studying at this point, and I said, well, why don't you tell me one? We're a couple even, if it's full of it. And he said, I'll do that. Well, that was our first year of 4 years of medical school, and guess what? By the end of 4 years of medical school, what he had not done. He had not come to me with any blatant contradictions in the Bible. Now, this is often because there's an ignorance, not just of the Bible, but the ignorance of the laws of logic. Anybody in here a computer coder, had any logic or taken a logic class in there? All right. There's something called the law of non-contradiction. And in its very sterile academic form, it is P, which stands for a proposition. P and not P cannot both be true at the same time. So let me give you a good example of that. If I state the sky is blue, and the opposite, which again in computer coding or logic you'd say not the sky is blue, but in English we would say the sky is not blue, those statements cannot both be true at the same time. That is the law of non-contradiction. So keep those in mind. Here are just a few popular contradictions that you may or may not have heard of. The first one is the number of the angels at the tomb. In one of the Gospels, it says that an angel appeared to the women that came to the tomb and said, Jesus is not here, he is risen, and so forth. In another Gospel, it talks about, in the plural form, that angels appeared to the ladies. Now, is that a contradiction? It may appear on the surface that it may be that, but it does not break the law of non-contradiction. Let me give you an example. So let's say after class here that Brian comes up and he wants to ask me a question, and he brings some friends with him on the front row. Very good, on the front row. And he asked me a question about that. And somebody asks some eyewitnesses. They say, oh, were you at the apologetics thing tonight? Yes. And they ask somebody in the back row, and they say that Brian came up and asked Dan a question afterwards. And somebody else, another eyewitness over here, said, well, Brian and 3 other people came up and asked Dan a question. Is that a lie? Is that a contradiction? No, it's just how eyewitnesses see things. And actually, we know that if eyewitnesses state exactly the same thing, we know that they probably got together and colluded beforehand. Eyewitness testimony is usually best if it's not exactly the same, but again, it's not a contradiction. Another one you'll hear is that the Bible talks about in Exodus that God parted the Red Sea, but elsewhere it says that the wind parted the Red Sea. Is that a contradiction? No. That's what I talked about earlier, a causal chain. There can be cause A that causes B that causes C, and so forth. So that is not a contradiction. The example I give for this one to the kids, they always love this one, is let's say, unfortunately, that somebody gets shot. And they go to the hospital, they try to save them in the emergency room, and unfortunately they pass away. Well, if you take the police report, the police might say something to this effect. the victim died of a large caliber, 45 caliber projectile that entered his chest cavity. Well, the emergency room physician might say in his report that the patient died of exsanguination, which is a fancy term for he bled out. The pathologist who does the autopsy might say that the patient or the victim died of a large hole in the left ventricle. Now, is that a contradiction? Are they all wrong? No, they just see things differently and they talk about different aspects of that causal chain. So, the third one that you'll often hear is that there are different gospel chronologies, okay? If you do look through the Gospels, some things that Jesus does are in a different order in the different Gospels. But Luke was the only one who claimed that he was going to give Theophilus, the guy he was writing to, a chronological account. So it's not a contradiction. So here's what R.C. Sproul had to say about this. Not every biblical discrepancy has been resolved, but the direction of the evidence is very encouraging. As biblical scholarship increases and our knowledge of language, text, and context increases, the problem of discrepancy becomes smaller and smaller. There is less reason today to believe that the Bible is full of contradictions than at any time in the history of the church. Prejudice and critical philosophical theories, however, die a very slow and hard death. And he also goes on to say that the Christian has nothing to fear from rigorous historical research. Rather, we have everything to gain. And so on this last topic, we're going to look at the external evidence test. What evidence do we have outside the Bible, from the world around us, that the Bible may or may not be true? The first one is there are multiple extra-biblical authors. I've listed a bunch of them here who corroborate at least some of the things that are written in the New Testament and the Old Testament. So we have that as our first external evidence test. Number two, prophecies. No biblical prophecy has been disproved. Many have been proved. Specifically, and we're going to look at this next week, so you don't want to miss next week. There's my plug for next week. We're going to look at Jesus. 30 to 60, depending on how you define proved, prophecies have been proved. There are 300 total about him, and we're going to look at those specifically next week. Isaiah, he mentions Cyrus by name, the king that released the Jews back to Israel several hundred years before that happened. And Matthew chapter 24, I have looked at this one, it predicts the fall of Jerusalem in exquisite detail. It talks about every stone from the temple will be taken off. Jerusalem will be hemmed in. There will be death. And it gives exquisite details that happen about 30 years later when Jerusalem fell in 70 A.D. But people are unaccepting even when they hear that. Number three, science. And again, I wish I could spend a couple weeks on this one, but you'll often hear this, that science contradicts religion. I hear this all the time, as I mentioned. Well, what science? What idea? What statement? When you get specific with people, it becomes a lot more fuzzy in their minds. But there are a few examples that you may hear and I've heard over the years. Number one, people say that the Bible advocates for a flat earth. Well, there's actually a verse in Job, and I can't quote it, I should have this, but it essentially says that that God hung the earth in space. Somebody look that up for me, I'll get that next week. But at any rate, when people write about things, they often write about it from their perspective, what we call phenomenologically. They describe a phenomena from their perspective. And here's this. So do you think when the weather forecaster gets on the evening news tonight and says, the sun will set at 6 o'clock today and it will rise tomorrow in the east at 5:45, do you think they get a torrent of phone calls from people saying, you moron, don't you know that the sun doesn't rise? It's the earth rotating, it just looks like it. No, because we speak from our perspective about phenomena that we see, just like the Bible does. Second one, evolution. And again, I don't have a lot of time to get into this. There's basically two types of evolution, if you know anything about this. There's what we would consider microevolution, like bacteria, that they get resistant to antibiotics. I believe that. That certainly, I think, is well established through research. Moths, you may have seen the famous moth experiment where in the Industrial Revolution, when there was a bunch of black soot, there became more black moths than white moths because they could hide better. Well, The Bible doesn't contradict that either. That's just a change in the ratio of different species. Survival of the fittest, etc. There's a lot of other things. But then there's what we call macroevolution. That's life from non-life, or new species coming from a bacteria, a single-celled organism, to where we are today. Those are not backed up by the science. And I would also mention, the more we know as time goes along, the more unlikely it is that these things happen. But again, I won't get into that. All right. Miracles. Let's spend the last couple minutes here on miracles. And we're going to talk about this more next week when we talk about the resurrection. There are many miracles that are described in the Bible and are absolutely essential to Christianity, such as the resurrection. Some objections to miracles that you might hear. Miracles cannot happen. Well, again, this goes back to, if there is a God, then there can be miracles. And logically, we know that it's possible that there is a God. And just because you've never seen one doesn't mean that's the case. To argue that the resurrection didn't really happen because the Bible is myth begs the question. For when unbelievers are asked why they think the Bible is a myth rather than history, they say it is because it is full of unbelievable miracle stories like the resurrection. That is arguing in a circle. Number 2, miracles violate the laws of nature. Far from undermining science, miracles presuppose it. So here's my example. Let's say we got on the roof and we walked off the edge of the roof. What would happen to each one of us every time it's tried? You would go towards the center of the earth. You would fall, okay? Now, what if in our world, if half the time or a third of the time people fell down, a third of the time they kept going straight on air, and a third of the time they went up? If somebody then walked off of it, would we call that a miracle? No. But the fact that every time that happens, people fall down, except maybe one time, like for instance when Jesus walked on the water, maybe that's a better analogy, that you have to have a regular universe where something happens the same every time in order to even identify a miracle. And a God who created, or let me go back. A violation is when someone who has to follow or uphold an established order fails or refuses to do so. A God who created the universe can perform any miracle he wants without violating any laws of nature. Last one on this, and I've heard this one. Miracles are maximally improbable. Well, if we just look at it statistically, it's unlikely that miracles would happen. Well, we don't know the probability or the likelihood that God would perform a miracle. It's not like flipping a coin. We know that's 50-50. You can calculate that. But you can't calculate if there is a God, if He do it, what's the likelihood that there'd be a miracle. If there was a God and He chose to use miracles to reveal Himself, there's not a single miracle He could perform that would convince somebody who believed miracles are maximally improbable. I won't read this whole thing. It just explains that in a little more detail. All right, the last one, archaeology, with the 60 seconds we have left. This is considered the most or the strongest extra-biblical evidence. Surely something has been found in the Bible that archaeology has absolutely refuted. Not true. There have been so many finds over the years, and even recently we're finding more and more things that corroborate, are consistent with what we find in the Bible through archaeology. Again, I'm going to skip through here real quickly. Here's something that when we were in Israel, we went to Megiddo, which is right near where Armageddon will take place, in the valley of Megiddo. And we found this, or they displayed this little thing from the 8th century BC that was discovered in the early 1900s that said, Shema, servant of Jeroboam, or Jeroboam. You heard that name? That guy was in the Old Testament thousands of years ago, and yet they found this thing that was inscribed there. And that's just one example of many. I'm going to close with the story of Sir William Ramsay. He is considered one of the greatest archaeologists to have ever lived. And he decided, you know what, these Christians in this Bible, I can't trust it. I'm going to go and I'm going to look at Luke. And I'm going to look at some of the stuff he talked about in the book of Luke and Acts, and I'm going to prove that he was a fraud. Well, guess what he came to discover after looking into this? Here's what he said. I may fairly claim to have entered on this investigation without prejudice in favor of the conclusion which I shall now seek to justify to the reader. In other words, he went in saying, I don't believe it. On the contrary, I began with a mind unfavorable to it. Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. So in conclusion, the last slide. The Bible is reliable. Its contents are trustworthy. You can say that you think the authors are lying, or they're crazy, or they're hoaxers, and that it is full of myths and superstitions. But you cannot say that, but you may not say that it says something the authors did not really write. You may not say it is full of contradictions and internal consistencies. And you may not say that there is little or no other extra-biblical corroboration. I'd be remiss if I didn't close in a word of prayer. I'm going to make it short, but let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Father, Lord, thank you for this evening, Lord. I thank you that you don't hide this from us, that if somebody truly is seeking you, they're seeking the truth, that there's plenty of information, that the weight of the evidence is that you are who you say you are, that you created this world, that you gave us boundless examples and information and evidence that you are real, that you love us, that you care for us. And we're going to look at next week that you sent your son Jesus, that he died on a cross, but we don't serve a dead God. We serve a living God and a living Savior, and that we can be sure of that from the evidence that you've given to us. I pray, Lord, that you would open our minds, that the Holy Spirit would fill us as we look at these things. And I just pray that that would be true of every person in this room. And that, Lord, as it talks about in Peter, that we be able to share this good news with people, that there is a reason for this, that God does love us, and that we could give that hope to people around us. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.